They judged him the second he walked in, smelling of dirt and bad luck. But what if the pauper who claimed he could buy $5 million machines actually had the funds? Tonight, we uncover how a dusty silence can shatter the most arrogant display of wealth, and why you should never underestimate the man who wears his struggle on his sleeve. The air inside the John Deere Platinum launch was thick with polished ego and the faint scent of aged scotch. Sunlight ricocheted off the chrome armor of the new X9 Combines, machines of terrifying power, priced only for dynasties. Everyone here belonged. Tailored suits, manicured hands, silent agreement on who held the real money in the valley. Then came Elias. He smelled like forgotten fields and hard labor. His boots carried the grit of 3 counties. He was an interruption. He crossed the pristine tile floor, his shadow a stain on their perfect evening. He walked past the murmurs of polite contempt, straight to the sales director, who looked down his nose as if checking for dust mites. Elias didn't flinch. His voice, dry as summer corn husks, cut through the sophisticated chatter. "I'm buying 5 X9 Combines." A sudden, devastating silence fell. Then the laughter started. It wasn't polite, it was loud, barking ridicule. "Did you hear that, Frank? 5? Does he think this is a petting zoo?" A woman in a diamond necklace covered her mouth, her eyes bright with malicious amusement. They saw only dirt. They heard only delusion. They dismissed the pauper. They had no idea they were laughing at the architect of their ruin. The stale air of the showroom, filtered and cooled to an unnatural temperature, felt like a mockery of the 7 scorching summers Elias had lived through. Those years weren't simply hard labor. They were a calculated campaign of erasure, a self-imposed financial desert where every drop of pleasure was redirected into the vault. His first decision was to discard comfort entirely. He lived on dry rations and debt calculation, sleeping in a repurposed grain silo that offered little defense against the blistering heat or the crippling cold. He banked every dollar earned driving night shifts for the freight company, shifts no one else wanted, the type that turned a man's spine into rusted metal. While the established growers spent lavishly on corporate jets and irrigation systems, Elias spent nothing, hoarding his meager resources with the maniacal focus of a general preparing for a siege. He wasn't just saving, he was starving the future to feed the present ambition. He discovered that the local bank, the one that routinely denied him even a modest loan for quality seed, was carrying a catastrophic amount of high-interest mortgages tied to failing crop yields in the North End. Mortgages the Valley elite hoped to quietly pass off to the public. This vulnerability became his first blueprint. The discipline was a suffocating pressure, a tight iron band around his chest that only his obsession could loosen. He owned 3 sets of clothes, all worn past the point of decency, and drove a pickup truck held together by sheer willpower and carefully applied epoxy. His peers, the younger men trying to make a name in farming, saw him as an embarrassment, a warning sign. They invited him to the Saturday night dances and the big harvest festivals, places where deals were cemented and respect earned. Elias always declined, or more often, simply stood them up. They thought he was antisocial, maybe a little simple, certainly beneath their notice. They didn't see the complex hand-drawn ledgers hidden under his cot, where every penny was accounted for, not just what he earned, but what he saved by teaching himself machinery repair from discarded technical manuals. The biggest breakthrough wasn't financial frugality. It was figuring out how to double the output of marginal, neglected land using a forgotten banned soil treatment method he learned about from an old chemist living on disability in the arid stretches of Arizona, a secret only he now possessed. The social dismissal was constant, a small irritating burn that eventually became scar tissue. Elias remembered Mrs. Albright, whose family owned the largest feed conglomerate in the valley, watching him load scrap metal onto his rusty flatbed. "Elias," she'd purr, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Some people just aren't cut out for this scale. Maybe you should try working for the county roads crew. Good steady hours." He merely smiled then, a small tight movement, knowing that the scrap metal she mocked was actually rare, salvaged titanium alloys he was repurposing for a new, experimental transmission system he was building in his silo workshop. Nobody realized that the old flatbed wasn't just hauling junk. It was transporting proprietary engineered components that only he knew how to assemble, parts critical for the next, highly automated stage of his farming plan. He was building the future while they laughed at his backwardness. While the big corporate farms relied on expensive, massive inputs and heavy machinery, the very X9 Combines he now intended to buy, Elias focused on micro-efficiency and absolute stealth. His tiny test field wasn't visible from any main road. He worked exclusively after dark, under the weak light of the moon, testing small, high-density plots that required specialized care. He designed his irrigation based on ancient Roman principles, mixed with modern satellite modeling, achieving yields that the established farmers insisted were mathematically impossible for the soil quality. They dismissed his efforts as backyard experiments or tinkering. What they didn't know was that these experiments were not about maximizing traditional corn output. They were about perfecting a new, resilient seed strain designed to thrive specifically in the acidic, neglected soil that comprised nearly 40% of the valley's undeveloped land that nobody currently assigned any market value to. He wasn't waiting for the market to appreciate the value. He was creating the value himself. The physical exhaustion was bearable. The real difficulty was the psychological strain of the waiting game. He didn't just need income, he needed catastrophic capital. He began subtly shorting the futures market on the very crops the local elite relied upon, leveraging his intimate on-the-ground knowledge of the region's rapidly changing microclimates and their excessive, unsustainable irrigation needs. He used small, untraceable lines of credit from outside the valley, meticulously paying them off months early to establish perfect, untraceable credit history under shell companies. He wasn't saving like a cautious man. He was accumulating power like a strategic commander preparing for the inevitable battle. His greatest risk was staking his entire 7 years of accumulated fortune on the prediction that the main regional reservoir would hit a critical low point exactly 3 years and 4 months after he started his aggressive shorting strategy, a low point that would completely bankrupt the heavily leveraged water-guzzling operations of his rivals. When the drought hit, it didn't just confirm his models, it generated the explosive capital he needed, capital entirely divorced from the local community's suffering. The last year was a blur of high-level financial maneuvering, sleepless nights, and the faint scent of ozone from his makeshift data center, housed deep in the silo. He hadn't seen a movie or eaten a restaurant meal in 7 years. Every missed comfort, every social slight, was a down payment on his ultimate freedom. His motivation wasn't luxury, it was proving them wrong. Every single one of them who saw only dirt and debt. It was the crushing memory of his father, destroyed by debt and forced to sell his small farm to the very man who now controlled the X9 Combine dealership. The ultimate goal wasn't just buying the combines, it was immediately customizing them with his proprietary, yield-boosting, low-water technology, which would instantly render the standard X9 models owned by the Valley dynasty obsolete, worthless technological relics on the secondary market. The laughter they offered was the sound of complete, blinding ignorance meeting inevitable consequence. They dismissed the pauper, but they failed to recognize the engineer and the financier who had spent 10,000 hours calculating the precise angle of their humiliating fall. The grit on his boots wasn't just dirt, it was the pulverized foundation of their inherited power. The sales director still looked down his nose, oblivious that Elias had already purchased through an offshore holding company the controlling minority share in the holding group that owned the X9 Combine manufacturer itself, effectively controlling the supply line he was about to disrupt. The sales director calculated the depreciation curve of the X9 Combines. Elias calculated the immediate, catastrophic depreciation curve of the entire valley's financial stability. The $18 million required for the fleet of combines was, ironically, a rounding error in his overall ledger. The powerful men of the valley assumed Elias must have scraped together debt or sold everything he owned, completely missing the cold, hard fact that his capital was liquid, privately sourced and untraceable by any traditional agricultural lending institution. He hadn't asked the bank for permission, he had simply purchased the bank's silent agreement to look the other way. That was the scale of the money. The valley barons, with their sprawling irrigation systems and deep-rooted legacy, chased the water table down, convinced that generational wealth lay solely in the rich prime bottomland. Elias knew better. He looked at the maps the state had dismissed 50 years prior, thousands of square miles of sun-baked, fractured volcanic plateau land. They called it the Dust Bowl's ugly cousin, suitable only for scrub brush and failed dreams. He started buying it up 8 years ago systematically, using layers of offshore holding companies registered across 3 different remote jurisdictions. Nobody in the valley, too busy counting their own harvest, ever bothered to check who owned the worthless dirt above the tree line. The true strategic value wasn't the dirt itself, which was marginal, but the altitude. Elias had quietly obtained access to leaked preliminary reports concerning the Midwestern Aqueduct Expansion Act, a vast, federally funded gravity-fed pipeline project. Its most efficient, high-pressure staging route required a major high-point reservoir. That reservoir, scheduled for groundbreaking in 5 years, sat squarely on 3,000 acres Elias had already secured, land the government assessors had valued at $10 an acre when he bought it. He was sitting on the future headwaters for the entire region, and his ownership was buried deep beneath layers of shell corporations. Securing the initial $5 million required its own surgical precision, a move that bypassed local finance entirely. He leveraged the plateau land, not for agriculture but for its hidden mineral rights, specifically low-grade, high-volume silica needed for specialized high-tech manufacturing overseas. The industrial banks didn't see a future farm. They saw a commodity feedstock supplier with guaranteed high-altitude access. He used the profits from the silica contracts to stabilize the rest of the land portfolio. While the Valley crowd obsessed over corn and soybean futures, Elias was quietly trading in silicon wafer inputs, a silent pivot, a financial judo move where he used the sheer weight of their ignorance against them. They never looked up from the dirt they knew. 3 years into the strategy, he knew the ultimate test would be validation of the land's underlying worth. A major Californian utility company needed vast, uninterrupted space for a centralized solar placement facility. They looked north, away from population centers straight to the plateau. Elias sold them a single, non-essential 800-acre tract of his holdings for $12 million. The sale was registered as a complex, multi-layered industrial real estate transaction designed specifically to hide the actual price per acre from public scrutiny. This single deal generated more than enough free capital to pay off all outstanding mineral debt and immediately fund the intensive research and development for his yield-boosting agricultural technology. Crucially, it established a wildly inflated yet invisible market precedent for the rest of his worthless acreage. The genius of the plan was the perfect convergence of land and technology. The Valley farms relied on vast, unsustainable water consumption. Elias's proprietary low-water technology, the very system he planned to install on the new X9 Combines, was originally engineered specifically to thrive in the arid conditions of the high plateau. When he finally sold the water rights for the future reservoir parcel years later, he received a staggering $90 million payout, but he sold the rights under one non-negotiable condition. He retained the exclusive licensing for all secondary water distribution technology within the new aqueduct district. This meant he profited not only from the water coming onto his remaining land, but from selling the essential technology that allowed everyone else in the district to use it efficiently. The final aggressive move against the X9 Combine manufacturer was never going to be a simple equity purchase. It was surgical, a financial decapitation. The parent holding company, Zenith Agri-Tech, was massive, but financially brittle, stretched thin by poor expansion. Elias used $30 million of his liquid capital to acquire the distressed debt portfolio of Zenith's failing South American logistics subsidiary, a division hemorrhaging cash and management focus. By suddenly becoming the primary debt holder, he gained leverage and seats on key internal committees, effectively using the threat of immediate bankruptcy declaration to coerce the private sale of the controlling minority share. He didn't just buy control, he financially cornered the company, twisting the arm of the very chairman whose sales director had once laughed him out of the showroom years before. Elias never spoke about his wealth. He maintained the necessary facade of the desperate, determined farmer who had scraped by through sheer will. His boots still tracked dirt, but the dirt now represented hundreds of millions in collateral that no one could seize. The tax filings were meticulously clean, the transactions laundered through dozens of layers of legitimate commerce that made even the best auditors dizzy trying to trace the original source. Only one man, a former Wall Street banker disgraced years ago for insider trading, and now fiercely loyal to Elias, held the master key to the complete ledger. If Elias vanished, the entire infrastructure of his silent fortune was legally structured to revert to an obscure charitable foundation, denying his enemies the cold satisfaction of inheriting the spoils. The sheer velocity of his success was its own best protective camouflage, Nobody expected the pauper to move at the speed of light. They expected visible struggle, public loans, and humble setbacks, not quiet, relentless acquisition of entire supply chains. The customization of the new X9 Combines was already secretly underway in a rented, unmarked warehouse 30 miles away. The yield-boosting technology, the proprietary system that would render every standard combine in the valley obsolete by the next harvest, was already installed on the prototype units. And the key intellectual property. It was quietly patented, registered under the name of Elias's late father, Samuel Vance, a ghost reaching out from the grave to reclaim his honor and oversee the downfall of his enemies. The Valley dynasty had no idea the patent infringement lawsuits that were about to rain down on their operations. As the sales director nervously handed over the stack of final purchase agreements for the new combines, admiring Elias's alleged ability to pull off such a feat of debt consolidation, he saw only the end of a transaction. He completely missed the beginning of a war. Elias knew the local water authority was preparing to announce drastic mandatory rationing, effective precisely 3 weeks from that very moment. The impending restrictions would absolutely cripple the prime valley land farmers who relied on massive, unregulated irrigation dumps. But Elias, sitting on his high plateau holdings and controlling the only efficient low-water harvesting technology on the market, wasn't just prepared, he was the monopolistic future. The grit on his boots truly was the pulverized foundation of their inherited power, and the wind was about to blow the dust away, leaving only ruin. Elisha stepped back into the massive showroom of Valley Power Equipment, but this wasn't the same man who'd been picking grit off the floor a week ago. The cheap work shirt was replaced by a crisp, tailored linen shirt, functional but undeniably expensive. The boots were polished, the stubble was gone, and the ragged desperation that had defined him had been replaced by the quiet, lethal focus of a surgeon about to make the first cut. Every eye in the dealership, especially those belonging to the usual cronies of the Valley elite, who were gathered ostensibly to buy new implements, but really to mock the local poor, snapped toward him. The shift in Elias's posture, the way he carried himself, immediately told them this was not a social call, nor a final desperate plea for credit. This was a closing. Mr. Sterling, the sales director, who had spent the last 7 days assuring the local farming syndicate that Elias's attempted purchase was a fool's errand based on hypothetical equity, froze mid-sentence, the cheap laugh dying in his throat. Elias didn't head to the financing desk. He walked straight past the loan officers, carrying not a binder of debt restructuring plans, but a slim, professional tablet. When he pulled up the display, the screen didn't show a line of credit. It showed liquidity. Sterling squinted at the numbers, realizing the total was far greater than the purchase price of 5 X9 Combines. The funds were already escrowed, originating from a holding company nobody in the valley had ever heard of, a ghost entity known only to aggressive private equity players. The silence descended like a physical weight, crushing the easy laughter and backslapping against the polished chrome of the tractors. Elias simply nodded toward the 5 monolithic yellow and green machines waiting in the back lot, silent giants ready to harvest ruin. The full payment, Elias stated, his voice low but carrying, is ready for immediate wire transfer. 5 X9 Combines, the necessary attachments and the inventory control systems. I assume you have those specific proprietary components secured as per our last conversation. Sterling gulped. He thought Elias meant standard GPS. But Elias was referring to the specialized low-water harvesting headers he'd engineered himself, components that were supposedly still experimental and currently patented under Samuel Vance's name, a legal landmine waiting to detonate under the valley's feet. Sterling's hands trembled as he took the tablet. The dollar figures scrolled across the screen, a sum that represented generational wealth to most people in the room, but here it was just the down payment on a reckoning. This wasn't some desperate final consolidation effort. This was fluid, aggressive capital, moving with speed and precision. One of the onlookers, a nephew of the Baines family, the biggest, loudest dynasty in the valley, leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the source, only to see the name of an offshore investment group known for ruthless, aggressive acquisitions of distressed agricultural assets. This man wasn't buying machines, he was buying the ability to starve his enemies. Mr. Vance, Sterling managed, pushing his glasses up, trying to regain the condescending composure he'd worn last week. This level of immediate liquidity. It's highly unusual for a first-time purchase of this magnitude. Where exactly did these funds originate from? We require due diligence. Elias offered a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. They originated from the successful monetization of overlooked intellectual property, Mr. Sterling. That's all the due diligence required. Also, I'll require guaranteed delivery by the end of the week, and I need confirmation that those 5 units represent the entire regional inventory of the X9 model currently available. I wouldn't want to leave any for my neighbors. The implication hit the room hard. Elias wasn't just buying combines for himself. He was cornering the market on the most efficient harvesting technology, locking out the major players just weeks before the biggest harvest season in years, securing a monopoly on efficiency. Sterling keyed in the bank details, his fingers fumbling over the keyboard, realizing that the dealership's previous attempts to stall the purchase had only given Elias more time to execute his true plan, a plan far more sophisticated than simple vengeance. As the massive wire transfer initiated, a transaction so large it required immediate verbal confirmation from the bank's VP and tripped the dealership's internal security alarms, Elias leaned closer. And the service contract must include immediate access to your top 3 master technicians, exclusive retainer for the next 90 days, paid up front, of course. Sterling stared, realizing the combined cost of the combines was almost secondary to the operational lockup Elias was securing. The Valley Power equipment was now officially Elias Vance's private armory, ensuring his new fleet would never suffer downtime while his rivals were left stranded. The Baines nephew, recognizing the name of the offshore holding company from a recent financial news article, a group specializing in strategic infrastructure, aimed at controlling regional resources, felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He wasn't looking at a competitor anymore. He was looking at an economic predator who had seemingly materialized from thin air. His uncle, the Valley's patriarch, had dismissed Elias as just a sentimental fool chasing ghosts of his grandfather's failure. The echo of that casual dismissal, once a source of comfortable superiority for Patriarch Silas Baines, now sounded like the mournful clang of a closing vault door. Silas, standing rigidly in his oak-paneled office overlooking the dormant Baines acreage, held the financial report, the latest quarterly projections, crumpled tightly in his grip. The combine purchase wasn't just an inconvenience, it was the first tremor of an earthquake he'd foolishly triggered by loaning Elias the money for the farm's upkeep, only to mock him publicly afterward. What the Baines family had always failed to grasp, or deliberately ignored, was the sheer, brutal geography of the Vance holdings. Everyone saw the poor soil and the marginal yields from the last generation, but Elias saw the watershed. His land didn't just border theirs, it contained the critical northernmost irrigation feeder line that serviced almost 40% of the Baines premium fields. For decades, while the Vance land lay fallow, that water was quietly redirected, absorbed into the Baines operations, an unearned subsidy that went straight to their bottom line. And here was the first sting. Elias had filed for immediate maximum capacity water usage, permits just hours before the wire transfer finalized, a move that would immediately throttle the Baines' supply. The mockery over the broken-down antique combines wasn't just a slight. It was a psychological operation designed to solidify the perception that Elias was operating on a shoestring budget and was easily contained. Silas had calculated that Elias would take months, maybe years, to clear and revitalize the long-neglected land, time they needed to finalize their own expansion into the neighboring county, thereby locking in regional pricing. But Elias wasn't trying to farm like his grandfather. He was executing a scorched earth infrastructure project. The new combines, roaring to life within the next week, wouldn't just be breaking ground, they would be ripping apart the very foundations of the Baines market dominance. The nephew suddenly gasped, pointing at the report. Elias hadn't bought planting equipment. He'd purchased heavy-duty reclamation rigs designed specifically for fast, deep restructuring of subsoil, the kind of work that takes huge capital and zero time. The Baines operation, and 2 other families, the Dwyers and the Harrigans, operated a tight cartel, dictating wholesale prices for the entire region by maintaining an artificial scarcity of premium produce slots. Elias's land, while marginal, was massive. If it entered production even moderately, it represented a 20% increase in local supply capacity overnight. They had bet their entire yearly profit margin that Elias couldn't mobilize the capital or the means to activate that land fast enough to spoil their harvest cycle. But the real revelation was chilling. Elias hadn't just bought the combines. He had secured the entire regional allotment of specialized seed stock, effectively guaranteeing that the Baines could only plant a vastly inferior crop this season. Silas slammed his fist on the mahogany desk. The combines themselves were only 3 million. We lose that much in a slow week. The nephew, Caleb, swallowed hard, looking at the fine print of the dealership contract that Sterling had regretfully forwarded. Uncle, the equipment was the bait. The true cost was the retention of those master technicians. Sterling confirmed that Elias's exclusive contract includes a non-compete clause for 90 days, effectively crippling regional service capacity. 90 days. That was the crucial harvest period. If one Baines combine failed, and given the age of their existing fleet several were due, they would be stranded, unable to repair or maintain their own lifeline, while Elias's brand new fleet roared on, guaranteed uptime. Silas paled, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The money Elias used wasn't just bank capital, it was the capital derived from the loan Silas had extended. The very loan meant to keep the Vance land dependent and docile. Elias had used Baines' money to purchase the tools necessary to dismantle the Baines' operational stability. It was an elegant, brutal irony, a classic move taught in the highest-level economic warfare courses. Utilize the enemy's resources for your own advance. And the scale of the offshore holding company suddenly made sense. They weren't backing Elias. They were Elias, a singular entity designed not for farming, but for the swift surgical acquisition and leverage of regional infrastructure. The Dwyers and Harrigans, the two junior partners in the Baines cartel, were now frantically calling. They had been the loudest voices in the public mockery, ridiculing Elias for his worn-out trucks and his desperate hope. They thought they were securing their position by publicly degrading a failing rival. Now they understood. Elias had calculated the exact social cost of their humiliation ritual and was demanding compound interest. The phone buzzed urgently. It was Mrs. Dwyer, hysterical. Elias had just purchased the entire stock of fuel reserves from their primary vendor, locking in 90 days of discounted, guaranteed supply for himself, leaving the rest of the valley to scramble for higher-priced imported gas. This wasn't personal vengeance born of rage. That would have been messy, predictable, and manageable. This was structural retribution, cold and precise. Elias didn't care about their feelings. He cared about their market share, their logistical weak points, and their cash flow. The purchase of the combines and the technician lockup wasn't about harvesting. It was about demonstrating immediate, overwhelming force and establishing an operational floor that none of them could reach. Caleb noticed another crucial detail in the banking report. The initial wire transfer for the combines was structured as a low-interest short-term loan backed by the physical assets of the land itself, meaning Elias hadn't even truly spent his own core capital yet. The farm was now funding its own destruction of the local economy. The silence in Silas's office was heavy, broken only by the frantic tapping of Caleb trying to pull up counter-strategies. But there were none. Elias had secured the means of production, the means of repair, the water, and the essential inputs, seed and fuel. He had created an economic chokehold overnight. The fear wasn't about the next quarter, it was about the next week. Rumors, fueled by the panicked dealership owner, were already circulating in the financial district. Buyers who usually contracted with Baines were hedging their bets, calling Elias's holding company for quotes. And the final blow was imminent. Elias had scheduled an aggressive press conference for dawn, titled simply, "The Rebirth of Vance Infrastructure," promising immediate regional disruption and massive job creation, painting Silas Baines as the outdated obstacle. "It wasn't luck," Silas whispered, his voice thin, finally understanding the depth of the mistake. "He knew exactly what we would do when we lent him the money. He knew we'd gloat. The truth was worse." Elias had spent the last 3 years meticulously mapping every vulnerability in the Baines system, using the small loan as cover while he mobilized international capital. The humiliation, the public scorn, it was all factored into the cost of doing business. It ensured that Silas underestimated him. And now the real trap. The Vance property deeds reviewed by Caleb contained ancient forgotten mineral rights previously worthless, which Elias was now leveraging through his holding company to secure financing for a massive regional data center project, a move that would fundamentally shift the land's economic purpose away from farming entirely, turning the Baines operations into an obsolete afterthought. Silas looked out at the rolling fields, fields that represented generations of Bain's labor and pride. Now they were just expensive pieces on a chessboard owned by a player he hadn't even acknowledged existed until it was too late. He had laughed at the man buying scrap metal. Now that man was buying his future. The combined loss from the water rights seizure, the technician lockout, the seed stock monopoly, and the imminent market disruption amounted to tens of millions, far exceeding the paltry sum Elias had paid for the machines. Elias had not just purchased farming equipment, he had purchased the strategic paralysis of his primary competitors. The silence in the office was complete, broken only by the sound of the first massive reclamation rig, already delivered and assembled under the cover of darkness, roaring to life on the Vance property line. The mocking was over. The game had just begun. Silas stumbled backward, the vibration of the immense reclamation rig rattling the crystal decanter on his desk. The sound was not just a roar of diesel, it was the sound of bedrock being ripped up, the sound of the future he had taken for granted being permanently repaved. He lunged toward the window, pulling the heavy velvet curtains aside. There, across the fence line, was Elias Vance. Not celebrating, not yelling, but merely standing beside the colossal machine, watching the first deep trench being gouged into the land. He held a clipboard, a figure of detached surgical competence cloaked in the rising dust of the Bain's demise. Elias had used the Bain's own hubris as his cover, understanding that the louder they boasted, the less they would hear the silent turning of his strategic gears. He had taken their scorn, folded it, and turned it into the very leverage that now owned their land, their water, and their market. The machinery was not just digging a foundation. It was burying the legacy of every Baines who had ever worked this soil. The irony was the final, choking realization. Silas had been so obsessed with proving his superiority in the public eye that he failed to notice the man who was quietly rewriting the entire game away from the stage. He hadn't been beaten in a visible fight. He had been dismantled by an invisible blueprint, a testament to the power of focusing on the outcome, not the applause. Silas watched as the sun dipped, casting long, fatal shadows over his fields, now irreversibly scarred by the first cut of Vance's shovel. The loud, arrogant kingdom crumbled not under assault, but under the weight of its own misplaced certainty. In the echo of his own booming laughter, Silas finally understood the bitter truth. The world is changed not by the voices that shout, but by the quiet determination that waits. For while arrogance demands the spotlight, true success is always built in the dark. Thank you for watching this cautionary tale of pride and silent power. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the ruthless psychology of success and failure.